Oh, there you go.
Merrily, 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 merrily.
I did it.
Success.
Come on. Oh, man. Come on. Stupid machine. Uh, okay. Uh, this may work or may not work, but we are on broadcasting on YouTube, but on a different channel because I was stupid. All righty. Let me ask all you folks, let's see. Share time. Can you see this? Wait a second. Eh,
It's on its way. Yeah.
Yes. There's
All
a
righty.
window blocking out the header, but yes, there you go.
All right. My problem is, and if someone can just send a note to Joe, I've screwed up and I can't get into uh, the TAC account for some stupid re well, it's not it's I know what the reason is. It indicates because he's the owner of the account, it Google says, well, you've got to go, you know, check off that it's your computer and or your account. And of course, it's not my account, it's Joe's account, and it has to show up on his computer. And so I don't know what the hell because I don't have his anyway.
I'll send you another.
All right. Those who have been patient to wait, welcome to Dis and Dat, the 9th of May, 2025. Life is but a dream. We're going to look at critical realism again because I keep bringing it up. I'm starting today not because we're going to talk about donut economics, but rather that the sort of homology or orthographic similarity between donut economics and critical realism is sort of there. Now, I'm not going to spend time talking about donut stuff. You can look at that or ask Warren. Um, the fact is that there is a donut of one kind or another, and this donut likeness is has a similarity in terms of comparing reality, that is the real domain, everything that occurs whether you see it or not. That's the enduring properties, the laws of nature, physics, whatever that is, chaotically moving along and expanding at that infinite rate. There is, of course, an actual domain, the domain that we can't account for everything that happens in the real world, uh, but we can account for stuff that happens to us and for us, as I just did by not signing into the right account. And then there's those things that we can sort of look at um, that we all share in that sense. That is the empirical. So there's actually three levels. there are mechanisms or mechanical things that create effects in this middle place where we are, the actual reality where we interrelate with people in our network or our environment or whatever. And then there's the rest of the world happening out there, which is ever more frightening. Now, I used donut economics to start with because it has that same kind of shape, the idea that we can make and take action and at things that are in the short term that are available to us that we can do, can work with. There is, as we go outward towards the horizon, as it were, there is the rest of the environment. There is a humanity, and then there is things that are beyond humanity that are out of control. So, without going over into the eco-socialist stuff, I want to talk a little bit about critical realism today because it's a body of theory that is, it's just a methodology. It's not an answer. It's not a, it's not an ideological cult or anything. It's just a body of ideas that answer some questions that are raised by people who are skeptical about having any kind of set of ideas or frames or discussion about nature. And it it bases itself in an idea that we have a kind of critical reality. If you want to go to the Hegelian, we have a kind of critical awareness of these kinds of things, and that we need to work through that by a system of, yes, it's sublation or subsumption or whatever you want to call it, but a way of re-engaging, always assessing a something that is perceived by many with a variety of approaches. We'll get to the details in a moment here. Here's one example is that we're usually confronted with much larger problems that we often cannot fix. And, some of us go into education because we think we can make a difference. Um, and we're depressed when we can't get enough people to move. You just sort of cynically say, well, I do what I can and hopefully something sticks. That's probably not the best way, but one still has to keep one's ideals. And so there's this collapsing inward, or, a kind of sense of ideals, or a utopian expectation in some ways. That's the empirical domain, which some of us try and fiddle around with. The reality, of course, is that there's an actual domain of activity that is, you know, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And it doesn't necessarily line up with what we think we really can do. So, similarly, and this is probably the better analogy or metaphor. It's like an iceberg. That is, the iceberg is only partially available to us at an empirical level, but the reality is much deeper. There's all kinds of things that occur that, without our seeing it, the Washington, D.C. still exists. It's really unfortunate, but it's still there. Um, and then there's the real level, with the causal mechanisms within structures that cause events at an empirical level to occur. So there's an invisibility and a visible kind of sense of that you have the sense of what is here and not here. What the ideological argument Lenin uses this. That is that we only perceive some stuff, and but yet there is a connection to the stuff we don't see, the stuff that we don't necessarily experience and observe. So it has this iceberg-like, and yes, I won't talk about Schrodinger, blah blah blah, but it resembles that. It has the same kind of structure. Note, of course, that there are different realisms. Um, we could say that yes, and some people only believe that there is one true reality, flat Earth, etc. That's kind of what we operate in. But the note that we take with critical realism that it is that there are multiple realities. Yet there's something that's shared by all of these things. And yes, these are ontological assumptions. That is, there are multiple valences, there's shared qualities. There's, as Wittgenstein talks about it, family resemblances is where Wittgenstein goes with that. The point is that this addresses an entire history of things that during a certain period were people attempted to reduce to language, that language always guided that. And anyone who has worked in creative fields that do not necessarily include language know that there are other languages, language-like things that are out there. Um, Cinema, for example, is not purely linguistic, but it has family resemblance. So anyway, and so an ontological assumption also implies, or at least within one philosophical context, is epistemological, that is, the knowledge claims. And so the point is, and what many educators have, one blames the left for believing this, and this has an entire history in and of itself that I've discussed in a variety of ways, is social constructionism, and it yes, it has dominated pedagogical practices and learning, uh, and it does sound relativistic. It moves towards that because it assumes multiple differing realities that may or may not have common features, and that's the kind of issue that some people approach. It's the skepticism about the woke, whatever. And of course, the stupidity of that, or the illusion there, is of course anyone who makes a claim about woke is automatically implying, or that their version of anti-woke is their version of woke, without getting into the nastiness of those sets of assumptions. But it's pretty clear that fascists have a being anti-woke just simply means that their ideological preferences are more politically correct, whatever that means. Now, I opened with the introducing critical discourse analysis yesterday, and I sort of yammered a little bit about it, but it is this idea of presence and absence in what is analyzed in terms of alternatives. And similarly, in a language sense, I mentioned Wittgenstein and ordinary language philosophy because one among many procedures in developing Miss Austin, J.L. Austin, is to be able to substitute syntactically other kinds of concepts to perform a series of, as it were, substitutions. And yes, it seems like a parlor trick at some moment, but in fact, that's what I just did when I talked about the woke. Anyone who asserts wokeism as a pejorative automatically implies an entire universe of anti-woke kind of ideologies, and they're not accountable to it, right? Because what? It's God or it's faith or some other kind of malarkey. Um, and so that's always going to be a problem. So I'm looking at and to winnow this down is by a guy who just did some really interesting work. What he did was he has you can look at this online. Um, all of Marx's Capital, Volume One, in parallel. You can read, and it's set of annotations among other things. He has a set of annotations to go along with it. So this Airbar dude has this on the University of Utah site that is a capital in one long 700-page column. And on the right hand side is all the German. So if you really wanted to look at, and this is there's volumes of Wittgenstein that are done the same way. In other words, you have the English on one side and the German on the other, and so you can sort of see where all the problems are or the advantages if you read a little German. So this is a short article, or is a chapter actually from a text, and it's on three critical realist arguments in Marx's Capital. So as you can see, I funneled it all the way down to this basic set of ideas, and I have like 25 minutes after I've monkeyed around with stuff, which I'm going to have to figure out before we do after hours tonight, or else convince Walter to do the broadcast. God damn it. Gosh darn it. In Capital, from Hegel to Baxar 3.1, in Capital, Marx uses Hegelian concepts and terminology extensively. For instance, shortly after the beginning of the first chapter, Marx concludes that the exchange value of commodities must be the quote unquote form of appearance of some substance called value. which is different from exchange value itself. So recall that he talks about use value and then he makes the comparison between, use value and value. And I've referred to it as big V value because it sort of implies exchange value, but it's also about the much larger instance of what counts and the whole notion of the commodity as being a social relation. Anyway, the subsequent discussion seems more akin to literary criticism than to political economy. Oh, too bad. Marx interprets the meaning of certain familiar kinds of market transactions in order to come to the conclusion that value consists of, and this is that problematic word, congealed abstract labor. We can sort of set the congealed aside just because it does always become problematic on the one, just because it assumes a certain, materiality. Uh, think of it more as synthesized, perhaps, or clotted. Now, right. So, further on, the arguments. Later on, a long section of the first chapter derives various quote unquote forms of value as surface expressions of this congealed abstract labor. These expressions have defects which lead in a dialectical development to more satisfactory forms. Now, some Marx scholars try to ignore these Hegelianisms. Others consider them to be an important part of Marx's argument. Lenin belonged to the latter camp. He wrote in his philosophical notebooks, aphorism. It is impossible to completely understand Marx's Capital, and especially its first chapter. Recall that, there are entire books written on the first chapter, without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. Remember, we left off in looking at that kind of argument about understanding Marx and Hegel at the same time, right? From different points of view, whether it was from a certain uh, a resurrection of texts like the Grundrisse, et cetera, that, the whole conflict of, well, we did all this Marx work, and then now you want us to go back and look at, rather than the phenomenology of Hegel, but rather the logic. And it's never one or the other. If you're going to do Hegel, you got to do both anyway. Consequently, half a century later, none of the Marxists understood Marx. That's a quote from Lenin. 80 years after Lenin, it is doubtful whether even an extensive knowledge of Hegel can make it possible to completely understand Marx's Capital. Those Marx and Hegel scholars who went this route have not achieved the hoped for breakthroughs. Hegel's system was presumably the best framework available at Marx's time to represent the structure of modern society. Thank you, young Hegelians. Now, 3.1, from Hegel to Boxer, or Boskar. I always get that. I guess I was thinking of B-29 bombers. Anyway, Boskar. But it is not a perfect fit for the purposes for which Marx put it to work. Many arguments which Marx makes in the Hegelian paradigm are metaphorical. Others are implicit, only indicated by Marx's choice of words, often lost in the translations. And certain other arguments are simply never made at all. As a consequence, to understand Marx has become a secret science open only to the initiated. Those go long passages of Marx's writing by heart so that they can hum a melody along in a tonal system which they are not quite sure about. All that is solid melts into air, etc. Fortunately, in the last quarter century, a cleaner and more persuasive framework for social science has been developed than Hegel's philosophy. I am speaking here of Boskar's critical realism as it is laid out in a variety of Boskar texts and other works. Boskar gives in the framework of the modern critique of positivism. The whole point I was making above was this idea of that you're resisting positivism and logical positivism because it tends to overemphasize logic built on language, because on oral language in one sense, or textual language, when in fact the text is not simply letter forms. The text is a whole intertext of a whole variety of things. And yes, that sounds all postmodern and blah, blah, blah. But our reality, the actual domain in which we work, is, it's not simply stuff that is printed out or written out. It's a whole bunch of stuff. And often So, Bhaskar gives in the framework of the modern critique of positivism a systematic and coherent formulation of the philosophical outlook to which Marx himself became more and more committed. This essay tries to reproduce Marx's arguments in the early parts of Volume 1 of Capital in a critical realist rather than a Hegelian framework. And so we already automatically have this problem of being accused of, yesterday we talked about that, that we had lost, or that Radulski, said, didn't do enough dialectic or whatever. That was what we did yesterday. It can be considered a test of a conjuncture formulated by Bhaskar. What accounts for Marx's and Engels' subsequent recourse to dialectics? See, this is where we are. My conjecture is, this is air. My conjecture is that it took the place of critical realism as the missing methodological fulcrum of Marx's work. Now, a lot of people don't, when you look at Bhaskar's life, he did all this stuff on critical realism, and then later on, I don't know what happened. Something happened, and I haven't read enough Bhaskar or his folks to figure out whether the things he did later in life were a little bit out there, because he gets real cosmic towards the end, that are not. It's not Marxism. It's not whatever. It's, or not even scientific. It's very problematic, but very religious and spiritual, and I think that's really important. If that's whatever, different strokes. But so anyway, if Marx is indeed a critical realist avant la lettre, it should be possible and beneficial to translate Marx's Hegelian arguments in Capital into critical realist terms. That's the point here. This essay attempts such translation. It gives a summary of Marx's argument, which tries to stay as close as possible to Marx's own, but in which critical realist categories take the place of Marxist Hegelianism. See, this is this bait and switch of the argument. My summary will differ from Marx's own development only because those steps, which are hidden in the Hegelian terminology, have been made explicit. Now, using categories informed by dialectical critical realism, DCR. Note that I introduced yesterday about critical discourse analysis, CDA, and I would assert that there's a connection, a family resemblance between CDA, critical discourse analysis, and dialectical critical realism. Yes, it's all a bunch of words, but actually, I think they share a certain level of methodology. Now, of course, a different paradigm makes things visible from a slightly different angle. Therefore, the arguments will also get a different flavor. Perhaps the reader of this summary will not even recognize them. Those interested are invited to download from the web the preliminary version of my extensive sentence-by-sentence interpretation of Marx's micrologic, called Annotations to Karl Marx's Capital, where they will find detailed textual evidence for the summary that follows. And yes, it's got a lot of pages, but thank God for digital files. 3.2, Marx's opening moves. Since society cannot be reduced to the individual, Marx does not begin the book Capital with the individual. His entry point into the social structure of capitalism is the commodity. So, Marx's opening moves. This is a plausible starting point. Since almost everything produced in capitalism is produced for sale, i.e., takes commodity form, the first thing that needs to be said about the commodity is that it has two factors, use value and exchange value. Marx discusses use value only briefly and then goes over to exchange value. Here he observes that our day-to-day experiences with exchange value are contradictory. Part of these experiences seem to indicate that exchange value is intrinsic in the commodities. If you drop a commodity and break it, then its exchange value disappears too, and others seem to indicate that exchange value is relative and only depends on the circumstances of the exchange. That is, the same good is sold at different prices in different stores or at different times. Marx takes this as evidence that a deeper level of reality is involved. Remember our iceberg. This is one of several places in Capital where Marx identifies a contradiction and then, often with the words, "let us look at the matter more closely," unquote, expands the discursive domain That's like CDA, critical discourse analysis, implies a discursive domain. In order to arrive at a more comprehensive explanation, Bhaskar recommends this procedure. A logical or other contradiction is not something to fear or to seek to disguise, cover up, or isolate. Rather, it should be taken as a sign that the existing conceptual field, i.e., categories, is incomplete in some relevant aspects. In the present situation, Marx comes to the conclusion that exchange value is the form of appearance in which some deeper attribute of commodities, which he calls value, expresses itself. So that's one way in which you can talk about the market, right? Talk about distribution and circulation. That at one level it is a sort of hall of appearances. In order to follow Marx's argument, we need to know what the words form of appearance and expression mean. I will therefore interrupt my summary here in order to explain these terms. When we observe the commodity producers trading their goods in the market, we are witnessing the second act of a two-act drama, which can only be understood if we also know the first act, Department 1 and Department 2. The first act is the production of these goods. Although commodities are produced on private initiative, their production is a thoroughly social process. You need other people to help you do this thing. The capitalists take it for granted that they will be able to find the inputs for production and labor power waiting for them to be purchased, that their money will be accepted, that their employees in turn can buy their subsistent means with their wages, that their own and their workers' skills enable them to produce a competitive product, etc. Seemingly autonomous activity of the capitalist competitors would not be possible without a high degree of coordination in the economy as a whole. Now, how is this coordination achieved? Now, interestingly, it is a mere side effect of the market activity of producers and consumers. In response to market signals, consumers adjust what they consume, and producers adjust their production schedules and technologies in ways which facilitate the functioning and reproduction of the economy as a whole. But they do not do it out of concern about the overall economy, but out of, as we looked before, it's self-interest. Their intent is to reach the best possible outcome for themselves in the framework of the market, and they employ many different techniques to achieve this. Despite these myopic motives, their interactions generally have the unintended side effect of keeping production on track. If there's not enough of something, productive resources are directed into producing it, not because of concern for the consumers or responsibility towards the economy, but because production of the scarce article is rewarded with high prices. See the White House. The producer's self-interest also induces them to introduce innovations quickly, to maintain the continuity of the production process, and to pay attention to costs and the consumers. That's like tariffs, right? Because they don't. This does not exactly lead to the most efficient use of resources and does not make the consumer king either. On the contrary, it ravages the Earth's natural resources most irresponsibly, while at the same time keeping the majority of the Earth's population in abject poverty. Now, but obviously, the system itself has remained intact for a long time under this regime. Commodity exchange and private property relations, which are located on what Marx calls the surface, quote unquote, of society. Remember, we're talking about this world of appearances thing, are the institutions which induce the producers to take actions that enable the continuing function of the economy. If the market provides the social interactions which keep production on track, one might think that the structure of the market determines the character of production. Now, this is a fallacy. Production in any society is a much more fundamental activity than the market. If social production were not structured in such a way that the market is needed, there would be no market. People go to market to exchange their products only because of the specific character of the relations which bind them together, and at the same time keep them apart in the social production process. You go into the store with your dollars, and the stuff should be there on the shelf, but soon they won't be. Causality goes, therefore, from production to the market, not vice versa. Market interactions induce the economic agents to take actions that uphold the systemic structure of social production, but this structure is itself logically prior to the market. Marx does not have a consistent terminology for that structure which lies beneath the surface of market activity, I will introduce such a terminology here and call it the core of the economy. Note that, you know, core and periphery is a dominant notion that is clearly, a Hegelian slash Marxist one that is applied to development economics and is very dominant in the last, half century or whatever. Marx uses Hegel's form content paradigm for the indirect and asymmetric link between surface and core. The surface relations among the economic agents are the forms of appearance of the principles which govern social production in the core of the economy. In Hegel's system, there is a close link between content and form. On the question of the relation between content and form, Marx took the standpoint of Hegel and not of Kant. Kant treated form as something external in relation to the content and as something which adds itself to the content from the outside. Let me break here for a second and say, this is why at a certain moment in the history of modern art, there's discussion of the sublime and sublimity. It doesn't, that's not the first time it's introduced, needless to say, but that notion is a Kantian one and not one that we necessarily hold to. But it exists, obviously. People talk about it. People make, there's a lot of ink spilled on that, at least in art history. From the standpoint of Hegel's philosophy, the content itself, through its development, generates that form which was already latently contained in the content. Form necessarily grows from the content itself. The form content paradigm is therefore, in many respects, appropriate for the situation at hand. It connotes that the market affects production in an indirect manner. It also connotes that the principles coordinating production in a commodity society are not generated by the market. Now, although they manifest themselves in and are mediated through the market, they invisibly already exist in the production process itself and can be defined without reference to the market. Now, that doesn't eradicate the market. It just simply it means it's like the difference that we make often between form and function. Is it syntactic? That is, that form precedes function, or is it that form produces function? And that's a fundamental problem that's fairly common and simple, hopefully. Nevertheless, I will not use these Hegelian terms in my summary of Marx's argument, but look at the links. See, this is that thing, but that talks about relations among things, the links between core and surface explicitly. The core surface distinction can be located in the intersection of critical realism and historical materialism. See, we really haven't left it. Some people will say that critical realism is simply, just another meta thing, but historical materialism is still there. A critical realist knows that society is stratified. Bhaskar speaks of the hiatus between the level of social structure and the level of the individual. Neither level is reducible to the other. And, if you want to look at a history of Western culture, that's kind of a problem in a variety of ways. Historical materialism explores the inner structure and historical development of the social stratum, distinguishing between, yes, base and superstructure, and between various modes of production. The core surface distinction captures the specifics of the social-individual interaction in capitalism. In capitalism, the economic base of society consists of two layers, the core and the surface. So there's base and superstructure. There's an economic base for society that is also composed of core and surface. So these are, similar but different. One is a subset of the other, right? The interactions of the individuals which sustain the economic and wider social structure take place against the backdrop of these surface relations. So there's a foregrounding and backgrounding kind of activity that goes on. Whereas the all-important relations of production are submerged in the core. The core is a hidden skeleton which holds everything in place, but which the practical agents do not address directly. Interpersonal interactions, like, amongst folks or between classes or whatever, are two steps removed from the coordination of production. They generate market outcomes, the surface, which have in turn repercussions for production itself, the core. The dislocation of the coordination of production from the sphere of production itself, that is the core, to the market, that is the surface, the core to the surface, production to the market, relies on the existence of two opposite channels of communication between core and surface. Now, so the core sends information about itself to the surface, and the economic agents who interact within the framework of the surface relations respond to this information sent from the core by actions which, as an unintended side effect, does indeed function um, from the fact that capitalism does indeed function, can be inferred that these two channels of communication between core and surface must be operative or interoperative. Whenever Marx uses the word expression, he talks about channel one, the core sending information about itself to the surface. And whenever he uses the word form, he talks about channel two, that is, the economic agents who interact within the framework of the surface relations. A metaphor may be useful to illustrate these two channels. Now, say the core of the economy is your computer and the surface is you. In order to run the computer, you need a monitor which tells you what state the computer is in, that's channel one, and a keyboard through which you give the computer instructions, channel two. At the beginning of Capital, Marx takes a round trip through these two channels. In section one of the first chapter, Marx begins on the surface and follows chapter two, asking how is it that the core must be structured if the market interactions of the economic agents are what mediates the structure? In Hegelian terms, this is the inference from the form to the content, a deciphering of the meaning of the form. In our computer illustration, this is the attempt to infer the structure of a computer program by the keyboard input. Section 2 verifies that the core structures postulated by the retroductive argument do indeed exist. Here, the computer illustration does not fit very well. Perhaps one can say that this step verifies that what we assume the computer program does can really be done on the basis of the inputs. In section 3, Marx follows the opposite channel, channel 1, and asks how the information in the core is transmitted to the surface, i.e., in Hegelian terms, how the content expresses itself in the form. This is the question about how the state of the computer is displayed on the monitor, the GUI. The second chapter verifies that this expression of the core principles developed in section 3 of the first chapter indeed creates tools on the surface which allow the economic agents to pursue their immediate interests. In the computer illustration, this verifies whether the display is something the user can understand and respond to in human language, HCI, right? Or the GUI. One notices that in none of these steps the computer is opened or its program is analyzed directly. You're not really getting down there and coding it. Since in the case of social structures, there is no box to open. Social structures only exist in their effects. Now that alone opens up a whole line of inquiry, but we won't go there for the moment. From surface to core. And I'm going to do this fairly quickly and probably stop because I used up too much time. I will now describe each of these 4 steps in more detail. After coming to the conclusion there must be something deeper underlying the exchange value, Marx explores what this deeper thing is. For this, he looks at the instructions, i.e. the keyboard inputs, which the market interactions on the surface send down to the core of the economy. Here, our computer analogy again has its limits. The economic agents do not deliberately generate instructions for the economy. Instead, they interact with each other in specific ways referring to concrete situations. The instructions which the core receives from these surface interactions are not based on these specifics. They are, in fact, in critical realist terms, quote unquote, transfactual. They exist beyond facts, whatever that means. One might view them as the resultant force from the sum total of innumerable interactions or their general footprint. Since each exchange equates one commodity with another in certain quantitative proportions, the transfactual impact of the multitude of exchanges crisscrossing the economy is that all goods have the same quality and differ only quantitatively. Now, this common same quality in the commodities cannot have anything to do with the bodily properties of the goods. There's no physical resemblance in that context, since it's exactly of the purpose of the exchanges to replace different use values with each other. So, in other words, the use values are too transitory to have an impact on the core. So you're still trying to account for a certain order at this other surface level activity. The instructions which the surface sends to the core must be compatible with the core structure itself, otherwise the economy would not function. And yes, we can talk about coding and a bunch of other things. If the instructions which the core receives all treats all goods as equal, as long as they're available in the fitting proportions, then the core structure of the economy must be such that all goods indeed count as smaller or bigger quantities of one and the same thing. Now, what is this one and the same thing, this common substance of all products? Now, Marx starts with the plausible, and at his time, still uncontroversial assumption that it must be the labor in the commodities. Labor is shared amongst all these things. But since the difference of the use value is not visible to the core, the different kinds of useful labor cannot be visible either. The labor which serves as a measuring stick for all goods in the core must therefore be labor in the abstract, i.e., labor which is indifferent towards the form in which it is expended. And the commodities, as seen from the core, must be congealations of abstract human labor. You see, there's where the metaphor breaks down, so to speak, or doesn't coagulate. Section 2 of the first chapter verifies that this is the double character of labor. Section 2 of the first chapter verifies that abstract human labor is not just a fiction, but that it really exists. There's really something that is common to all labor processes. 3.5, every labor process has two aspects. On the one hand, it is the skillful handling of the object. On the other, it's the expenditure of human brain, muscle, etc. Under the second aspect, all labor is very much alike. Otherwise, it would be not possible that the humans can use their brains, muscles, etc., to perform a multitude of different kinds of labor. Labor is not completely alike, and that is, not all kinds of labor can be performed by everyone. Arnold Schwarzenegger, for example, but most labors can be performed by most members of society, and this is what matters. Usually, the workers need training before they can perform specific labor processes, but if one prorates the training time over the labor time performed, one ends up with quantitative, not qualitative differences of abstract labor. Now, one often hears the argument that abstract human labor is the product of capitalism, i.e., that there's no abstract labor outside capitalism. This is not my reading of Marx. Every labor process is the expenditure of human brain, muscle, sense organs, etc. In other words, abstract human labor is an aspect of every labor process. The fact that the same word labor is used for different activities shows that this abstraction can be made. Capitalism, is it neuron, neuron activity or whatever? You could really get nuts about this, neural net in that sense. Capitalism is distinguished by the fact that this aspect of the labor process is the criterion by which social production is directed. The core only sees the abstract labor, i.e., only through the abstract labor is the labor process socially connected. This special role of abstract labor leads to the split of the labor process into two parts. Now, this is where we get back to Marx, right? Concrete labor creating use values and abstract labor creating values. From core to surface. Section 3 of the first chapter explains how information from the core of the economy is transmitted to the surface. That is, how the computer represents its inner state on the monitor. Marx shows that already the simplest exchange relation, for instance, remember the old 20 pounds of linen equals one coat, contains expressions of the values of the commodities involved, i.e., the two parties agreeing to such an exchange import information about the values of their products from the core into the surface. So look, for instance, at the linen weaver. She knows how much labor and expenses are contained in the 20 yards of linen she just produced. She does not have the same information about the coat, but she knows that it is a product of labor, i.e., that she has to give up part of her own labor, that is producing the linen, to get it. And she knows the use value of the coat, that is to wear it, to shelter yourself from the elements, etc. By agreeing to exchange her linen for the coat, she tells the market that to her, the coat is a worthwhile reward for having produced the linen, i.e., she expresses the value of her linen in the use value. Now, Marx observes that here the linen is active and the coat is passive. The linen weaver has spent labor producing the linen, labor which is wasted if she cannot exchange the linen against something she needs. She will not rest until she has made this exchange. This expression of value is only an individual act. although, um, although value itself is a social relation binding every social production process together. In the remainder of section 3, Marx explains how this expression develops through its own inner dialectic. See, we're still back to the dialectic. His own inner dialectic into the institution of money. The linen weaver needs not only a coat, but many other things. The activity of the linen creates, therefore, not only one, but many expressions of the value of linen. Besides, in coats, it's also expressed in tea, coffee, wheat, gold, iron, etc. This so-called expanded form of value is no longer purely individual. It reaches out into society. The very arbitrariness of the individual expression has given rise to a social totality of expressions. But these expressions do not yet induce a surface behavior that can leave a transfactual impact on the core because the expressions are not homogeneous and simple enough. What Marx calls defects, quote unquote, are those features of the expressions of value which prevent them from functioning as conduits through which the surface agents pass instructions down to the core. So there's an underlying notion of function that is there. Therefore, a second transformation becomes necessary. And again, this transformation is already implicitly given. Since linen expresses its value in coats or tea or coffee or wheat or gold or iron, all those other commodities also express their values in linen. Now, a deliberate social act is necessary, namely the consensus to set linen aside as the commodity in which all other commodities express their value. This is the problem of the commodities market. This leads to the general form of value, the first form of value in which the expressions of value resonate with each other to yield a social consensus which can be heard in the core. Now, this is not yet the end of it. The money form of value differs from the general form of value in only one seemingly innocuous detail. Now it is known a priori that gold is everywhere and always the general equivalent. Now, note that this is during Marx's time, and obviously there are other things, but this is to try and concretize this example. Since there can be only one general equivalent, this is an obvious further step. But we will see that this welding together of a social form of value with one particular use value has far-reaching implications. But before taking this up, Marx discusses another or a different issue, and that is the fetish-like character of commodities. Now, I think I'm going to do all of this on Monday because I've got a lot more to yammer about here, and we haven't even gotten to money. Um, I think we can cover all of this on Monday. And whether critical realism makes a difference. I think what it does generally identify is the difference between theory and practice, or praxis, and that it relies on agency or action. And so the difference between things that we consider as objects or subjects have some sort of intermediated thing that goes on. And you can see here in this diagram from interior to exterior, we have the difference between core and surface activity. And yes, there's lots of words there, but I'd like to think that it makes sense, that critical realism gives us a tool by which we can say the things that we've normally thought were, well, that just happens in the background, or it's the theory behind something. The whole problem of even making that utterance, it's there's something behind, there's a theory behind this. It's not always it's not always behind it. Let's put it that way. It's always not a simple juxtaposition of one thing obscuring the other. Our perception of those things is much more fully integrated, and I think that that's what critical realism allows for. And in this little thing that I put at the end, uh, you know, this gives you the introduction to a critical realism. Yes, it does evolve within sociology, but it's applied in a wide variety of things. And so Archer, Sayer, Lawson, Tony Lawson, the same guy who I had mentioned before about social ontology, is part of this initial attraction to critical real. There is something that links us all together. Ultimately, this still all comes back with all due respect, at least for the Tony Lawsons of the world. It all comes back through Cambridge in that particular sense. So yes, it's a bunch of too much academic thinking and lots of diagrams and problematic just simply because it's a lot of spinning, I suppose. So anyway, I'm going to stop there because I've gone over time, or I'm at time of what I've yammered about. Let me look at the chat. I've got to solve, of course, this network problem because as I've been multitasking as I've gone through this, and I screwed up my system on my end. So I'm hoping we'll be able to do after hours at 7 o'clock. So let me just thank you for your attention, and then stop share.